Giant Steve. This terrifying monster hasn't existed for all that long, but his impact on the world has been disastrous. So join me as we explore the story of Giant Steve. Not too long ago, there was a war being waged against the villagers, and they were losing badly. But just as it looked like things couldn't get any worse for the villagers, one of their own had corrupted and created their own faction to bring terror on the villagers. So now the villagers were fighting two wars at once, and so many were in constant meetings discussing what they needed to do. But for a long time, no one knew what to do. But after a while, one villager spoke up.
We could bring back the warrior. He could fight the traitor, whilst we focus on the villagers.
The room went silent. That warrior was the great Steve, and he had been the greatest fighter to the ancient villagers. But he had been put in an eternal sleep long ago. And there was a rule amongst the villagers that they would never disturb their great warrior from his sleep, with the only exception being an apocalyptic event where everyone's life was in serious danger. But after some discussion, all the villagers agreed that today was their apocalyptic event, and the only solution for their survival was going to have to be awakening the Steve. And so a small group of villagers left the meeting, and they went to World Spawn. And there, they summoned him. The Steve was awoken, and they explained everything. And Steve, still being the brave warrior he was all that time ago, agreed to the mission. And with that, they all leave to go towards the traitor's domain. And when they arrived, it was all a very foggy area, and there were rumours that there were thousands of villagers trapped within, and that there were hundreds of witches and skeletons hiding in the shadows, waiting to ambush anyone that dared to enter the domain. And it was because of that threat of the witches and skeletons that the villagers didn't want to go any further. And so this Steve entered the swamp all by himself, while the villagers left him to fight their own battles against the villagers. And when he first entered, he made sure to be very cautious, and so he had his sword constantly drawn, ready to attack any ambushes. But for the first few hours of exploring through the swamp, he didn't see any ambushes. In fact, he didn't see anything. But then, suddenly, he heard it. The cries of a villager deep within this forest. And so he started running towards it, thinking that a villager was being detained by this evil traitor. But whilst running at top speed through this thick fog, he fell in a hole. Now, normally that wouldn't be too much of an issue, as he could just climb back out and continue running. But in reality, before he could even do that, he was actually ambushed by a group of witches who all emerged from the shadows, and they're throwing mysterious purple potions at the Steve. The Steve was stunned, as he wasn't really expecting to get ambushed in some random hole in this massive swamp. But very quickly, through the use of his sword, he was able to exterminate that threat. But after he does that, he feels a bit off. But he just thought that that was because of those witches were throwing poison potions at him. And so he just climbed out of that hole and walked over to a nearby river. And then through the use of the flowing water, he tries to wash off the potion effects. But even after the potion effect was removed, he still just felt off. And so he just stands there for a moment, thinking what he needs to do. But as he does that, those villagers who had left him not that long ago had returned to him. And they'd done that because they wanted to gift a few additional resources to the Steve for the battle he was going to have to fight against that traitor. But as they walked closer and closer towards the Steve, he turned his head to face them. And what the villagers saw made them sick to their very core. The Steve's eye had fallen off, and at first they all wanted to know what happened to him. But then they realised whatever thing did that to him was probably still around here. And so before even giving the Steve anything, they all ran away in fear. But the Steve just stood there, not really caring about the villagers running away from him, as he was actually trying to comprehend the extreme pain that he was feeling with his eye gone. And he was also trying to think how this had all happened. But then he very quickly concluded that all of these injuries were a result of those potions that those witches had used. They must have been some sort of dark magic. But still, with all these scars and pain that he now had, he knew that he had to continue with his mission, as he had a duty to do so for all of the villagers' sake. And so he started to walk deeper into the forest. And whilst walking, he hears it. The traitor was calling out, and it was moving. The Steve stood still for a moment, trying to triangulate where the sound was moving to. And once he had, he ran for it with his sword drawn, ready to attack. However, he must have made a mistake in his calculations, as he ended up running off a cliff, and he almost dies. He was now bleeding all over, and the pain was intense. But this wasn't going to stop him. He could still hear it in the distance, and so he slowly started to walk towards it, still having his sword drawn. However, the pain was too much, and so he just had to stop, and he decides to just sit down for a moment. But as he sits down, a witch emerges from a nearby tree, and she runs up to the Steve and whispers to him,
"You killed my sisters, and now this will hurt."
And she threw a potion at the Steve. The Steve went to turn around and attack, but before he could, he blacked out from the pain, and the witch just walked away whilst chanting about seeing him easier next time. Several hours passed when he finally woke up. But as he awoke, he couldn't see properly. Everything looked darker and unclear, and so he ran to a nearby puddle to see if there was something on his eye. But as he stared down, he saw something even more concerning. He had lost his other eye. And then he looked at the rest of him, and that was injured too. But that wasn't all. He'd also grown to twice the height he was just a few hours ago. But in spite of all this pain that he was suffering through, and the fact that there were probably other dark magic wielding witches out there, he was still determined to push on and kill that traitorous villager. And so he stumbled his way back into the fog, and again he waits for it to make another sound. And when it does, he starts walking as fast as he could towards it, this time very cautiously. But then suddenly it starts moving in all different directions, and then abruptly stops. The Steve didn't know where to go from here, and so he tried walking in the general direction he thought the sound was coming in, but after a few hours, he had no luck. But then he encounters something very strange, as in front of him is a villager. A villager? How did it get here, thought the Steve. And so he ran up to it, but before he could reach him, it just vanished into thin air. The Steve was confused, and he looked around to see if he could find him, but no luck. He had just gone without a trace. The Steve then went to where the villager was standing and looked in the water to see if it had somehow been dragged into it, but he didn't see a villager drowning. Instead, he saw something even more horrific. His own reflection. It was horrifying. Those injuries that he had sustained earlier were now far more visible, and those wounds were clearly deeper than he had originally expected, and were probably permanent. The idea that the Steve would now be stuck with these scars forever haunted him. Being this ugly creature, and not that great warrior he was all those millennia ago, almost convinced the Steve to give up here, as why should he continue fighting? Why not just return to a sleeping state? But the warrior spirit inside of him remained, and he knew that deep down he couldn't stop. Not now, after all this. He had to find that villager traitor and kill him. It was his duty to do so, as otherwise all other villagers would suffer, and he was not going to let that happen. And so with a sudden burst of motivation, this ugly big Steve ran back into the fog, determined to find that beast. But for every step he ran after that point, he grew in size, becoming bigger and bigger. It was almost as if that enlargement effect that he had gone through earlier had just been amplified with his newfound desire to hunt. And so after just taking a few steps into the fog, he had grown to a staggering 12 blocks tall, and he had become the giant Steve. Now, that might sound bad, being a giant, as it just meant that he was a bigger target for all the witches and skeletons in this fog. But in reality, this was great, as being a giant meant that the Steve's pain, which was so concentrated before, was now spread out all across his giant stature. And so without those extreme pains on him, the giant Steve was able to sprint once again. But as he ran, he shook the world slightly, and he left behind giant footprints. But the damage he might have been causing to the world didn't matter to this giant Steve at that time, as he was now searching the traitor's domain at incredible efficiencies, and he hoped that very soon he would be able to find his prey. However, after a few days of searching at this incredibly high efficiency, he wasn't able to find the traitor. And that really frustrated the giant Steve, as he had never not been able to find his prey in at most a few hours, and this was taking a few days. In fact, he was so frustrated with this that he let out a loud roar, and then he started jumping up and down whilst punching down at the ground. But one major thing that he might have forgotten whilst doing this was that he was a giant now. And being a giant meant that when he yelled out in anger, that his shouts were so loud the glass shattered. And when he jumped up and down and punched the ground, he sent sizable shockwaves all around him. And those shockwaves had some quite extreme effects for any village anywhere near him, as they were flattened to the ground, as if they'd just gone through some sort of earthquake. And as such, many thousands of innocent villagers were killed by the giant Steve during his act of rage. But not just that, thousands of other structures were destroyed too, and many avalanches were triggered by these shakes, which resulted in even more death. Meanwhile, those villagers who had awoken the giant Steve were talking, and they were discussing about how much of a mistake it was to bring this Steve back, as he had now caused so much damage, more so than even the original threat that he was summoned to kill. And the worst part of all this to the villagers was that the giant Steve hadn't even succeeded in killing him just yet. Or had he? As the trembles in the world were most prominent in the traitor's domain, as that is where the giant Steve was jumping up and down. And it was because of those shakes that the evil villager traitor had been knocked off a cliff and killed. And so the world was freed, as the giant Steve had just unintentionally killed this source of evil. And so the villagers now only had the illagers to worry about, but they wouldn't have to deal with them for too much longer either, as one villager ventured back into what remained of the traitor's domain, and he discovered something inside that changed everything: cloning technology. And so to find out what happens next, you'll need to watch this video.